We are in the middle of an increasingly open and integrated world economy where countries compete for investment and human capital that are critical for their economic growth. Country competitiveness has become a central theme for both developed and developing nations. So what is competitiveness? It is the long-run productivity of a nation as a location to do business and the ability of firms to compete successfully in the global economy. The IMD World Competitiveness Yearbook defines it as how an economy manages the totality of its resources and competencies to increase the prosperity of its population. Increased competitiveness creates greater prosperity. How is Kenya doing? Kenya is becoming an increasingly attractive investment destination. Kenya was ranked the third most improved economy globally for the second year in a row in the Ease of Doing Business Index. It was the only African country that made it to the top 10 most improved countries, where it was defined as one of the 2 innovation outperformers in sub-Saharan Africa. Kenya was singled out as one of the 7 outstanding emerging markets worth investing in globally. Nairobi is ranked the most attractive destination for FDI in Africa. In the recent past, Kenya had the privilege of hosting world leaders led by US President Barack Obama, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Japan's Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, South Africa's President Jacob Zuma, and Pope Francis. It is important to note that this is the first time sitting US and South African presidents visited Kenya. Kenya made history when it became the first African country to host the 6th Tokyo International Conference on African Development. He has also had the privilege of hosting several international meetings, such as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the World Trade Organization Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, and the African Green Revolution Conference. All these point to the fact that indeed Kenya has taken its rightful place in global economies as the hub of Africa. What does becoming Africa's hub mean for Kenya? Kenya has become a friendly environment for ease of doing business, leading to more investments. Subsequently, more jobs have been created from these investments. The image of this country has improved significantly, leading to an increase in tourism. It is important to note that after President Obama's visit, tourists from the US surpassed those from the UK for the first time in Kenya. Demands for ancillary services such as meetings, incentives, conferencing and exhibitions have gone up. The confidence of local and international firms to stay and do business in the country has grown. It is important to note that local businesses in Kenya have become the biggest investors in Africa. Nairobi has overtaken Johannesburg as the fastest growing destination for FDI for the first time. The Kenya Economic Update Report cites higher developmental spending on major infrastructure activities such as the SGR and geothermal power generation as catalysts to increased investor optimism. Our efforts to improve the business environment are also yielding positive results. What are the determinants of competitiveness? The competitiveness framework explains the determinants of competitiveness at 3 levels. Endowments. This refers to the inherited attributes and resources of a nation, which include its natural resources, geographical location, and population. Most of these endowments are found at county level. The macroeconomic level sets the economy for productivity to emerge, but is not sufficient to ensure productivity. Competitiveness at this level is driven by macroeconomic policies, social infrastructure, and effective political institutions. But true wealth creation happens at the macroeconomic level and is largely influenced by the private sector. productivity ultimately depends on improving the quality of the business environment, the state of cluster development, and the sophistication of the company's operations and strategies. Altogether, these three levels determine competitiveness. What are the issues affecting our competitiveness? Microeconomic issues. Though macroeconomic policies do matter, many of the microeconomic drivers are tied to the counties. These include the quality of the business environment, cluster specialization, and business strategy and operations. Endowment issues. We are destroying our abundant natural resources. Trees keep falling faster than they are growing. Additionally, in various counties, we need to manage community expectations better to prevent disruption to development projects. Macroeconomic issues. While it is true that corruption is a major issue in Kenya today, it is critical to remember that for the first time in the history of this country, and largely due to the system put in place, we now know when, where, and how corruption is happening. This is a very important step in the fight against corruption. It is encouraging to know that His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta recently came out strongly against corruption and has put in place measures that will help to curb this vice. There is a need to support the President in this endeavour. However, it is important to realize that we too have a part to play in affecting the country's competitiveness. Politicians and government officials, for example, wield considerable influence over their constituents and supporters. Irresponsible utterances and hate speech can incite unrest and divide the country along tribal lines. Civil wars occur due to ethnic or tribal strife. Global history has demonstrated that politicians are responsible for ethnic strife in many regions of the world. Ethnic strife passes through 4 stages before violence finally breaks out. These stages are marginalization, ethnic profiling, ethnic mobilization, and finally, a trigger. Ethnic marginalization occurs when one ethnic group is perceived to dominate another in leadership positions and distribution of natural resources. This domination often makes the dominated group feel left out of the country's important affairs, thereby making them disgruntled with the regime and its leaders.
Vlada se raspala, narod je prepušten sam sebi.
Just before the civil war broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992, the Bosnian Croats and Muslims did not want Bosnia to join with Serbia. Their reason was that the Serbs would take over their land and the country's leadership, leaving them to languish in poverty. This call was started by Bosnian Muslims and Croats seeking power. The second stage before a civil war erupts is ethnic profiling. This is the stage where one ethnic group starts to analyze and brand the other according to a real or perceived ethnic description. When Rwanda gained independence in 1961, the leadership of the country was handed to the Hutu over the Tutsi, who had ruled under the Belgians. Since the Hutu had felt aggrieved by the Tutsi rule, they started to identify and brand Tutsis with names such as cockroaches and tall trees.
appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Nyingi, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
This branding was a revenge tactic to systematically bunch Tutsis up and deprive them of any access to state jobs and resources now that they were no longer in power. The third stage towards ethnic violence is ethnic mobilization. Ethnic mobilization is a stage where most politicians and people in power rally their supporters against another ethnic group. Before the Rwandan genocide started in 1994, Hutu politicians and people in power incited their ethnic group against the Tutsi.
Listen to me, good people of Rwanda. It is time to clear the brush, good Hutus of Rwanda. We must cut the tall trees. Cut the tall trees now!
During such incitements, politicians and people in power create paramilitary youth wings that are camouflaged as campaign groups. The Hitler Youth was created in Germany, the Interahamwe in Rwanda, and the Dozo in Côte d'Ivoire. The Interahamwe youths were to later perpetrate the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi and Hutu moderates. From these seemingly innocent stages, the last stage is a trigger to the ethnic violence. This trigger is usually an election, an assassination, or an event that will unite an ethnic group to rise in arms over another. In the Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda and Côte d'Ivoire cases, the ignition to ethnic violence was an election. In the past, Kenya has gone through these stages, with elections always being the trigger to violence. This was the case in 1992, 1997, and 2007. But in 2013, we went through a relatively quiet election. As we approach the 2017 elections, Kenya seems to be going through ethnic profiling, but this time more at county levels, where tribal and political alignments are diverse. The 2017 elections could once more be the trigger to violence in Kenya. While violence can take a real and sad human toll, the economy is also affected. According to a report from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, Kenya's GDP plummets during most election years. This is disturbing. However, the exception was during the 2013 election, when our GDP actually grew. This was attributed to a concerted effort through a multi-sectoral partnership of media practitioners, religious organizations, private sector alliances, leaders and developmental partners to preach peace around the country. As we head into the election season of 2017, we all need to be extra vigilant in our utterances as leaders. Preaching peace and unity will not only save lives, but will also protect our economy. Our development partners also have a role to play. Travel advisories issued by foreign governments discourage travel by citizens of those countries to Kenya. Statistics from the Kenya Tourism Board indicate that about 600,000 Kenyans are directly employed by the tourism industry, which contributes 12.5% to the country's GDP. Travel advisories lead to negative publicity, which in turn leads to massive cancellations and consequently loss of jobs. To maintain our competitiveness during the 2017 election year and to grow our GDP, we need, firstly, a sustained and concerted effort. The private sector must continue to carry the positive narrative of a growing nation to keep investments coming into the country. Politicians and government officials must protect our environment and the economy and keep away from hate speech and instead preach peace and inclusive positive messages. Development partners must continue to work with governments and the private sector to ensure the prosperity of the nation. Secondly, a coherent strategy that will set an agenda to improve Kenyans' competitiveness. And lastly, a coordinated focus in priority areas. All these to enhance competitiveness that will lead to inclusive prosperity. If the private sector, politicians, government officials, religious organizations, the media and development partners purpose to work together to protect the business environment and to preach peace, we will not only have a peaceful 2017 election season, but we will also promote and grow Kenya's competitiveness.
Sitaiacha Kenya.